Welcome to week 9. This week I want to talk about more practical things and less sort of theoretical issues than some of the things we've talked about previously. So the last several weeks we've kind of dove into the analysis methods and particularly the statistical analyses, which are absolutely essential for getting valid results out. But the truth of the matter is they're not enough, right? So once you actually have your activation maps, how do you interpret them? How do you make sense of what the actual findings are? That's what I'd like to talk about in this week's set of lectures. There are only 2 this week. There's a little bit less material than some of the previous weeks, but nonetheless, I think that in terms of what you can really do with fMR, this is pretty important material. And the other thing I should say is, unlike some of the previous weeks where, at some level, they're really uncontroversial issues. I mean, there are right ways and wrong ways to set up a statistical model and things like that. This week is a little bit more subjective. Honestly, throughout the module, I haven't shied away from sharing what I think are the right things to do and what are the not right things to do. I have tried to provide an explanation for why I think that, but of course it's entirely up to you to decide what's the right way to proceed, hopefully with all the information so that you're making an informed decision. So I think that that's the way you need to interpret both this week's lectures and then next week when we talk about common mistakes that can be made with fMR. And I'll continue to try to point out where there's a difference between what's just factually the way it is versus my particular opinion so that you have the opportunity to decide what's appropriate when you proceed with your own fMRI analyses. Okay. So with that said, the aims this week are to introduce a couple of tools for visualizing your data, both at an individual level, but also at a group level. For the most part, most of us are interested in the group level analyses, but sometimes it's very useful and informative to go back and look at the individuals who make up the participant set as well. One of the things I'm going to talk about and perhaps hammer just slightly is the importance of simply plotting your effect sizes. It's really hard for me to overemphasize how valuable and how necessary that is in order to correctly interpret your data. And we'll talk about that in a couple examples. And then the final point I want to talk about is how do you know where the activation is? I mean, you can see it on the image, but when you go to report it, what part of the brain is that? What do we know about that kind of part of the brain? How confident can we be in reporting that it's in X, Y, or Z region? And what are the tools that can help us achieve that level of confidence in reporting our results? And as I said, from my perspective, I think these are really practical issues that are essential to any successful fMRI study. Okay. So I want to start with visualizing the results. That's really the first step in terms of understanding what you've got. Once you have your statistical inference done, you've got your activation maps, how do you look at them in order to make sense of them? And I think that there are a number of things that you can do. One of the things that I often start with that's really not essential, but I nonetheless find it informative, is looking at full color images of the statistical parametric maps themselves. So before I do any statistical thresholding, I find it can be useful to look at those images, and I'll take you through that. The next thing I do is I do look at the thresholded maps, but I tend to use very statistically lenient thresholds. That is to say, I want to get a feel for what's in the data before I really start hiding it by, looking at the multiple comparisons problem and correcting for those multiple comparisons. And I think that that's a useful thing to do in order to understand your data. And then, as I said last week, I tend to avoid using cluster-wide thresholds, certainly for the initial analyses, because I feel like cluster thresholds can really hide small activations that can be very, very strong. I mean, you may have massive, strong activations, high, good height thresholds, that just aren't spatially very large. And nonetheless, that could be potentially informative. So if you avoid using a cluster threshold, you avoid the hiding those things, particularly in your initial looks. One of the things that I always emphasize is choosing a sensible background image. And I think this is something that doesn't get a whole lot of thought. I think that people just pick whatever's convenient, and often they default to using canonical images that are very precise and look great, but maybe start to give you the incorrect information because it's not an appropriate choice. So I think it's important to at least consider what's the right background image to use, and then you can decide as appropriately for yourself. And then finally, I want to talk about plotting the effect sizes. I'm going to talk about it across conditions, but also across the participants in the experiment as well. So let's just start with these faux color maps. I'm not doing anything fancy here. I'm simply, plotting the beta values for a particular condition, an effect size. Or if you prefer to do something a little bit more complicated, you can plot the contrast image, the COPE, the contrast to parameter estimates. So if you have a more complicated design and what you're really interested in is A versus B rather than just A versus rest, then plotting the contrast image or the COPE image is a sensible thing to do and may give you more information than looking at, for instance, just the raw beta values. But either way, these are effect size images. They're not thresholded. So there are positive effects that are shown in warm colors here. There are negative effects that are shown in the blue colors, the cool. But one way or another, it's just the effects. And it just gives you this is the ultimate non-thresholding, right? So next step is going to be lenient thresholding and then more stringent thresholding. But this is where I start. And the advantage here is, one, it gives you an idea of your coverage. So like in the right-hand image, one of the things that you can see is that the very anterior frontal pole doesn't have any statistical values there. Why is that? Well, that's because of distortion. In this particular case, and it's often the case with fMR, the y-axis was the dimension that phase was encoded on. And that means that a lot of this material was actually pushed into the prefrontal activity. It may be that you reverse your phase, in which case it would be, there'd be activation out the skull in the front of your brain. But nonetheless, it gives you a quick and dirty feel for what is the distortion and how strong is it in the images. The other thing you can see in that is that there's a hole above the nasal sinuses, and that is signal loss. That's just dropout. And again, if that's an area that you think is important for your study, it's very critical that you know that you just simply don't have signal there before you actually start thinking, well, why don't I see anything significant? Well, it's not a thresholding issue. It's not a design of your model issue. In this case, it's just a raw data issue. You have signal dropout there, and it's something that you need to know about, and you should know about it early rather than later. So I find looking at the raw images helpful. I don't spend a lot of time on it, but for instance, if there are bits of things in my group effect sizes that are missing, one of the things you can do is then go back across the individuals and see why. Because one of the things the software does is that each voxel that's included in the group analysis has to have had a value in the individual subject's analysis. If it doesn't, if one subject for some reason doesn't have signal in an area, then that voxel isn't included in the group map because you don't have data from everybody to do it. So sometimes you find holes in your group images because something went wrong with one of your participants. And again, this is a very informative step for me. It doesn't take a lot of time, and I don't spend a lot of time on it. But the value and the time it saves from me, if I skip it and then proceed to other steps and then figure something's wrong and have to come back, this saves me an enormous amount of time, gives me information to start with. So I recommend it. Your mileage may vary. Then the next thing that I tend to do is use relatively lenient statistical thresholds. So I tend to default to a voxel-wise threshold with an uncorrected P001, which corresponds to a Z height of 3.09 or 3.1. And the reason for that is it's got a very high false positive rate, but it has a very low false negative rate. And at the moment, all I want to know is what's in my data. So I'm not worried about whether it's a true positive or a false positive at this point in time. I'm more interested in just trying to understand the pattern of results. It's somewhat akin to simply plotting your data in a normal behavioral experiment. If you did something that had, a memory test that had accuracy scores as the primary dependent variable, then I would plot the accuracy scores. I would probably plot them as raw values and get a feel for how they cluster. I mean, is it the case that I get a nice normal distribution, or is it the case that there's some sort of binomial distribution there or something odd, some skew in the data? Without looking at the raw data, I can't see that. If I jump right to the stats, I would miss those things. In fMRI, it's harder to look at all of the raw data because it's got 3 dimensions to it. I mean, 4 if you look at it before you've done any of your statistical analyses. But you can start looking at it in 3D. And what I recommend And the classic thing that almost everybody does is look at it in 3 2D slices. Typically, they are a coronal slice, which would be if you were to slice from top down and look at it from either the front or the back, and that's the left image. A sagittal slice, which is something along the X plane, or an axial slice, which would be if you were to just slice the head flat parallel to the ground and then look at it from above, right? And after a reasonably short period of time, you get able to look at these coronal, sagittal, and axial slices and start to create or generalize to a 3D model in your own brain about how these regions connect with one another, how they're located together. It takes a little bit of time, and that's something that really can't be rushed. The more time you spend on understanding neuroanatomy, and functional neuroanatomy, the better you're going to be at interpreting your results. And we'll talk about ways of building up that knowledge. It's something that I think gets ignored in functional imaging too much. I mean, everybody's doing it to some extent, but I think that a lot of us are looking for shortcuts in terms of understanding neuroanatomy. And while I understand that, I don't think that that's very helpful. I think that it's worth spending the time and effort to develop a pretty good understanding of the basic neuroanatomy, or in many cases, the more detailed neuroanatomy. And functional imaging offers you a lot of opportunity to do that. So I tend to use this more lenient statistical threshold. Some people will go even more lenient than that. But this is a case where it's really important about the cluster set here, right? I'm using a voxel lenient threshold. If I put my Z height score to 3.1 in a cluster and then put a p-value of 0.05 on it, all of those activations that are smaller than something reasonably, reasonable size are going to disappear because they don't extend larger than that minimum cluster threshold. That p-value instantly hides all the things that don't reach that significance level. I don't want things hidden at this point. I just want to get a feel for what's in my data. The other thing that you need to decide, and again, I think people don't spend a lot of effort on this, but maybe it's worth a little bit of effort, is what is the underlying anatomy? What is the picture that I want to use for my image? Now, if you're looking at a single subject's data, then if you collected their structural image, I would argue that the only sensible thing to do would be to display their activation on their anatomy, right? Because you have both sets of data, and obviously the activations came from that person's anatomy, so that would be the only sensible, valid, reasonable kind of thing to do. However, that's often not the case. I mean, people frequently will display it on other images, and we'll talk about those in just a second. If you're looking at group data, then I think the same principle applies. It makes sense to display the activations that you achieved from a group of participants on the structural anatomy of those group of participants. So that is to say, I would be inclined to suggest you should create a mean of their structural that you put as your underlying image. And the reason for this, and this is again a personal opinion, but I think it's grounded in reasonable sort of logic, is the functional data came from this set of people. So what you're overlaying it on should be representative of those set of people. And since almost everybody routinely collects a good quality, high quality structural scan for their participants, it really is no trouble because you have the data to create a mean of the group and then and put it as your underlay. We can talk about how you create that mean in just a moment, but one way or another, it makes the most sense to show the functional data from a person on their own structural. And if it's a group, then show the functional data from a group of people on their own structurals. One of the alternatives is that people often use what's called the canonical brain, or the Colin 27 brain. So back in the day in Montreal, there was a guy named Colin who volunteered to have, I think it ended up being 27 different structural scans of his brain. This is in the 90s. And as a result, when you average them, line them up and then average them all together, you get a very, very high resolution, crisp, beautiful image of a brain, Colin's brain. The problem is this canonical brain, which is often referred to, is from a person who wasn't in your study, right? So you get this illusion of anatomical precision that may or may not be accurate. Here's an example, right? So the functional data in this case are the exact same. They're the same data from one participant. The participant structural scan is shown on the right as the underlay, and column brain is shown here on the left. And I've put them at the same resolution, so the column brain has lost a little bit of resolution as a result of me trying to make them as comparable as possible. But nonetheless, you can see that the yellow in both cases are the same, right? There's no difference there. What difference is the background image. And hopefully what you can see is the data in the parietal lobes show that there's activation in the interparietal sulcus in the one hemisphere and definitely in the superior parietal lobe in the other, right? So if there's any doubt about it being IPS, it's IPS but on the more superior surface. In contrast, if you show that same activation pattern on the canonical brain, you would see that the activation is certainly up to the inferior parietal sulcus, intraparietal sulcus, excuse me, but it tends to be on the ventral surface. It tends to be on the inferior parietal lobule. So in other words, you could incorrectly localize your activations rather significantly. There's a big difference between inferior and superior parietal lobules. Simply by showing it on the wrong background. And that doesn't always happen, but it can happen, and here's a good example of that. So in one case, you would conclude that, yes, intraparietal sulcus is active, and if anything, it's more superior and into the superior parietal lobule. And in one case, you would conclude incorrectly that it's IPS, but it's also extending into the inferior parietal lobule. So in other words, all of the conclusions that you would draw from that would be incorrect simply because the background image you chose, presumably for convenience or because it looks great, localizes the activation to the wrong anatomy. And that's exactly what we need to avoid. It's not that Colin's anatomy is wrong. It's not. It's just that he wasn't in this study. The functional data don't come from him. So therefore, showing the functional data on his brain provides, one, an incorrect level of precision, and two, in some cases, incorrect localization because everybody's anatomy is slightly different. So my rationale here is please show the activations from your subjects on your subjects. Back when I was reporting my very first fMRI study, so I was a postdoc and I had just moved to Oxford, and they have this cognitive neuroscience summer school that I got to attend. So this is back in the year 2000. And I was presenting my fMRI results of my first study as a poster. And Dick Passingham walked up to my poster, and I didn't really know who Dick was at the time. I was sort of young and naive, but if you haven't run across him, Dick is an absolute legend in neuroanatomy and was one of the founding members of the Hammersmith neuroimaging group here in London, where between that group and the group in St. Louis, they were the two pioneering functional neuroimaging labs in the world, and Dick was one of those original people. Dick looked at my poster and he said, "Oh, look, you've got bar plots showing effect sizes. The only valid fMRI studies, only useful fMRI studies include bar plots or the equivalent showing effect sizes. Well done." And as a sort of young postdoc, I was unduly excited about the fact that I had this sort of neuroscience legend tell me well done simply because I had included effect sizes. But I think that represents a very strong perception in the community, which is showing the activation maps is great because it gives you some information about the spatial layout. But what it doesn't tell you is anything about the size of the effects and their relation across conditions. So this is an example from a paper from Sophie Scott, one of my colleagues at UCL, and it actually comes from a PET study rather than an fMR study that she ran. But I think it's a beautiful illustration because what you can see is she's showing the activation in this part of the superior temporal sulcus on the lateral surface of the brain. And what she's done is she's divided the way the conditions play out across those activations. So although she only got one blob for the particular contrast, there are actually different patterns of results here. So she had 4 conditions in her experiment. Those are shown on the x-axis of these bar plots. And you can see that, for instance, 1 and 2 show basically the same pattern, whereas 3A and 3B show the same pattern, but it's different from 1 and 2. There's no way you would know that if that was just a colored blob on the screen. You only know that by looking at the pattern of conditions across those different regions that she's illustrated in these corresponding bar plots. Now, does it need to be a bar plot versus some other kind of plot? Not necessarily. As long as you're showing the effect sizes across your conditions, you're giving the reader the information that they need in order to interpret what the pattern of results are. And that can very significantly change the way you interpret your results. We talked about that a little bit when we talked about inclusive masking, because when I plotted effect sizes, you could see that there were loads of different ways of getting a main effect. And it wasn't until I had included all of those masking conditions that I'm ensured that the main effect was what we probably interpret as a main effect. The easiest way to see that is to take a voxel from a region of interest and plot the effect sizes. What is the pattern of effects, and does it match what you think it matches, what it should be from your contrasts? So I know I belabor to some extent the importance of plotting effect sizes, but I would say the single most important thing that you can do when trying to understand your own data is go to the regions that are of particular interest to you and make sure that you plot the effect sizes there so you know exactly how those conditions relate to one another, because that information can change your interpretation dramatically in cases of your findings. There are multiple ways to plot effect sizes, so that's across conditions in a group study. But the other thing that you can do is you can also look to see how consistent are the effects across the individuals in your study. So in this particular case, I'm looking at a peak shown in green there on the right, at the posterior part of the superior temporal sulcus in this particular study. And I had 18 participants in this experiment, and I've just numbered them 1 to 18 on the x-axis. And I'm plotting the effect sizes here. And the first thing you can see is, sure, on average, there's some activation there, and it's got sort of a mean effect size, and that's very useful. But it's very clear that at least 2 of the participants show like negative effects in that area. They don't follow the group pattern at all. And several others, like subject number 15, for instance, shows a really minimal effect size. So the question is, are my results being driven by just a few subjects who maybe show large effects and everybody else is just kind of like meh? Or is it the case that there's something meaningful across the group? This is, again, a useful way of visualizing what's in your data. Now, there's an argument about what's the right way to do this if you're going to show, if you're going to plot the effect sizes. You might just pick a voxel. So the common thing to do would be to say, well, this is the peak coordinate from this particular activation. I'm going to plot the effect sizes in this voxel. And that's not a crazy thing to do, right? The reason that that's sensible is because there's a lot of smoothing in your data. So when you're plotting from that one location, you're getting activation from a surrounding area. It's a weighted average of the surrounding tissue. It's not the case that you're just getting something idiosyncratic from this one voxel, because of course, individual voxels are not independent of their neighbors. On the other hand, some people have suggested that while that's true, it is just data from one voxel, and you have a whole cluster there. So if you want to argue that it's representative of the cluster, a better thing to do would be to average all of the voxels in that cluster. So for instance, that's what I've done in red. So all of that little green sort of cluster there that looks like it's got kind of horns, I just took all of those voxels and averaged the effect sizes across those. And you can see in some cases, it doesn't make any difference. So if you look at subject number 2 and 3, a single peak voxel versus the cluster give you essentially the same pattern of results. There's nothing really different there. But that's not the case in everyone. So for instance, if you look at subject 6, whose peak voxel was going in the opposite direction, if you look at the cluster, it's actually sort of small but positive activation there. And that's even more so for subject 11, who showed the strongest deactivation at the peak, but across the cluster shows strong activation. And it's not always the case that cluster gives you better results than a peak. They're just slightly different, and there isn't a right and wrong here. So if you're going to quantify how consistent your activations are across your participants, then plotting the subject effects is a sensible way to do it for either peak voxels of interest or perhaps clusters of interest, depending on what you think is the right way to do it.